meeting of this Rotary year and our 5,018th all-time club meeting in our 103rd year. Wonderful to see you all here today. Our guest speaker today is Tim Watson-Munro, criminal psychologist. Tim will be speaking on a peripatetic life of a criminal psychologist and will be more formally introduced by our chair of the day, Stephen Rando, later in our program. In the meantime, would you please join me in making him welcome? Thank you, Tim. That's all right, just a guest. We have a number of special guests. We are delighted to have former member Professor Dr. Harald Schmidt and his wife Beate and his son Tim from Germany. Harald has kindly offered to speak briefly on his area of expertise of pharmaceutical repurposing, and I will be more formally introducing him shortly. Also here as our guests of Reg and Sue Smith, we have Maggie and Hamish McDonald, who are founders of the newly established Melbourne Arboretum in our city's north. And here for our social visit, we have our District Governor-elect, Michael Lapina. Please join me in making these visitors and their guests welcome. Thank you. We have other visiting Rotarians, visitors and guests of members. I invite you and your host to stand when your name is announced and ask that you remain standing to enable the club to welcome you in a collective manner. First and foremost, James Nixon, guest of Rosemary Nixon. Grace Fryer, guest of Richard Dent, niece and Detective Senior Constable in Vicpol. Welcome. Alexandra Florea, guest of Ramona Martinovici. Anne MacDonald, guest of Susan Barton. Anne O'Donovan, also guest of Susan Barton. Brioni Bottarelli, guest of Bruce Davidson. Zita Presmutas, guest of Irina Bayer, in the back there. Harvey Cohen, also guest of Irina Bayer. I have a few guests as well. Darlene Haddad, over there. Peter Kapoyanis. And online we have Theologia Keramikis, Weeby Abdo, Catherine Thomas, and Adriana Cousteau. Visiting Rotarians, we have David Fernie from the Club of Pakenham. Welcome, David. And Monica Nagel from the Rotary Club of Perth. Please join me in making our guests, visiting Rotarians, welcome. Thank you. It is my pleasure now to introduce Professor Dr. Harald Schmidt. Professor Harald Schmidt is a former member, 2005 to 2009, and a Ross Abbey awardee of our club, and is currently visiting Melbourne with his wife Beate and his son Tim as part of a sentimental journey. He is a German doctor and pharmacist and head of the Department of Pharmacology at Monash University. Now he works in big data and clinical research at Maastricht University in Netherlands. And we look forward to his commentary on the end of medicine as we know it. Dr. Schmidt, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I joined the club 20 years ago. I returned with my family 15 years ago, and now we are basically catching up with some of the places, some of the friends, and this club really made me feel home in Melbourne, and is still my favorite club. You have a fantastic club, the hands-on activities, the breadth of activities that you do, it's really amazing. So congratulations again. But today I would like to briefly show what happened in the past 15 years, what we've been up to, and it's really exciting. So it's not the end of medicine, it's only the end of medicine as we know it. And you might think, what's wrong with medicine? we are looking actually in the moment at the beginning of a so-called Kondratiev wave. If you have studied economy or maybe engineering, you have heard of that expression before. These were the major socio-economic revolutions in our society. They usually last 40 years. They begin with a huge crisis. They abolish concepts that we thought will be there forever. Things appear that we would have thought are completely impossible. So for instance, the invention of the steam engine on the left enabled the Industrial Revolution. Since then, we had a couple of other Kondratiev waves, mainly based on another energy source. And I think we all agree that the most recent Kondratiev wave was the IT revolution. But we are at the end of the IT revolution. We have our Amazons, our Apples, our Microsoft, and so forth. And futurologists think the next big thing is actually a complete redefinition of psychosocial health. So how we define health, how we preserve it, and how we regenerate health. And all these waves start with a crisis. And you may say, what crisis? So, for instance, you would be right if you say mortality has decreased since 1900 dramatically. That's a huge achievement for medicine, and it is. But let's have a look. What was the contribution of preventing and treating infections? So hygiene, vaccination, and antibiotics. That's the red line. By the way, the peak is the Spanish flu. And now when we subtract the red line from the black one, that's what medicine has achieved in all other areas since 1900. And actually, since several years, the life expectancy in most Western countries is decreasing. So there are several reasons for that. The biggest problem we have in medicine is that we actually don't understand any disease, with the exception infectious diseases. What usually happens is that the patient, without a symptom, routine checkup, goes to a doctor, the doctor measures some symptoms, cholesterol high, blood pressure high, and so forth, or he comes with a symptom, can't breathe very well, can't exercise very well, and then the disease is named after that symptom. High blood pressure, asthma, inflammatory bowel disease. These are all descriptions of symptoms. There is no understanding of what the cause is. And if you don't understand the cause of a problem, you can't repair it. So it becomes chronically defect. This is why we have so many chronic diseases. It's a capitulation of medicine that we can't cure diseases. There are many sort of scientific reasons for that, but the biggest error that we have done in medicine, me myself as well, I'm not the wise guy, but we have to come to the conclusion that splitting up the human body organ by organ and having for every organ a clinic, a clinician, and a research discipline like neurology, neurologist, and neuroscience, cardiology, cardiologist, and cardiovascular research makes absolutely no sense. Think of rare diseases where we actually know the cause. A single gene is the cause for a rare disease. And those patients very often have symptoms in 2, 3, 4, 5 organs. That's the simplest form of a disease. And it shows us already an organ-based approach makes no sense. Or even worse, naming a disease after a doctor. Alzheimer, Parkinson. What sort of disease definition is that? So to cut a long story short, for me personally, the eureka moment was when I saw this publication actually by a physicist. It's a network scientist. He did something that we with our brains would never be able to do. He did the network of all human diseases at once. In this network, the diseases are linked through shared risk genes. And you see that some diseases form little groups, colorful groups. And in these groups, That means diseases belong together, which we in the moment treat by different doctors. We do research in different disciplines, but genetically they belong together. And you can do these networks also with comorbidities. So if two diseases always occur in the same patient, maybe there are not two diseases, maybe they are the same disease. So this big data. And to validate all of this, we extract now from these genes actually the disease mechanism. Basically what we do is we turn this network upside down. What we now call a disease is just a phenotype. And we want to define the causes of the disease from those genes that basically are glue between those phenotypes. And to show this as fast as possible, we have done a second thing. You may have heard that the discovery and the development of a new drug can take up to 16 years. And it costs between in a good year, 2.8 billion, in a bad year, $5.4 billion to bring one drug successfully to the market, because this one drug has, of course, to counterpay all the unsuccessful attempts of that company. And what we do is we take drugs that are already on the market, where we know the side effects, and try to find new indications for them, which means we don't have to develop anything. The drug is already on the market. We go ideally directly to a phase 2 clinical trial. That's the proof of concept in patients. And we are in touch with regulators, at least in Europe. They say you don't need to do the phase 3 trial because they are not usually very representative anyway. And we hand it directly over to SME and industry. So what usually takes billions and takes up to 16 years, we do within 2 years, 500,000 maybe. So to bring these innovations to the patient, and with this precision, we think it will be possible in future to actually cure diseases. And if we have done that a couple of times and have biomarkers with which we can monitor whether a disease risk is actually manifesting in a patient, we could even intervene earlier, even before the patient ever had the symptoms of his risk, and even prevent the disease. Thank you.
Well, I must say that was absolutely fascinating. Whirlwind, but looking at the health system in that way, I think it's one of the new positive mechanisms, which maybe even AI can help.
It does.
In doing things. Now, Dr. Schmidt, it's wonderful to have you back at our club with your family. Sorry, can't hear? Okay, all right. So, Dr. Schmidt, wonderful to have you back at our club. We have a gift here for you. It's one of our legendary socks, Rotary socks, limited edition. You can't get anywhere down the street. Please enjoy.
Thank you.
And it's 200% Australian, because it's made locally by our past president, Philip Endersby's company, Wilderness Wear. And we hope you enjoy it and look forward to seeing you and your family back again soon.
Very much. I still have the yellow lycra from around the bay. You know,
very good. Okay, just a couple of notices before we move on to our next speaker. Rodney Smith, who's a long-time member, has shot off a missive to Joe on Monday, advised that he's almost had a month in hospital with influenza and pneumonia. He's currently in respite care and hating it. Please speak with Joe for more information and to connect with him. Next, on the 21st of February, we have one of our big orations, the Angus Mitchell oration at the Sofitel in the La Trobe Room. Our speaker this year is former US ambassador to the US, the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos AO, chairman of the Asia Group, former Liberal Party politician. And if you've been watching that fascinating ABC show, Nemesis, he's thrown a few comments in, but I think we might ask him for some more when we see him. Seats are limited. We've had over 100 bookings to date. Representatives from a couple of consulates will be here, leadership from a number of charities and also business groups in this country, as well as Rotarians. So I'd hate for you to miss out. So please arrange bookings and also to bring your family and friends. Next week, we're having a rather different format. We're going to go and sit in the park where you're going to sit in the Rotary Peace Park for a picnic. And that's organised by our evening team down in Domain Road in South Yarra, which will be the site of the Peace Bells later this year. So BYO picnic, seating, plenty of options nearby for snacks and drinks for those coming from work. And past President Adrian will conduct an informal tour of Rotarians featured on the commemorative plaques in the park, and look forward to joining us and having a wonderful fellowship activity as well. Details will be in the bulletin, and there's also flyers on the table. And now it's my pleasure to call on the chair of the day, Stephen Rando, to take over the meeting and more formally introduce today's guest speaker.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an extraordinary opportunity we have here today to explore the intriguing realm of forensic psychology, guided by none other than the eminent Tim Watson-Munro. With a career spanning an impressive 45 years, as discussed just over lunch, Mr. Watson-Munro has left an indelible mark on the field, having assessed over 30,000 individuals and lent his expert testimony in court over 3,000 times. I'll let Tim talk about his earlier days and his 25 years of age in starting at the infamous Parramatta Jail. Tim Watson has also held esteemed positions, such as the former national chairman of the College of Forensic Psychologists within the Australian Psychological Society. He's also served as a visiting fellow at Melbourne University and also a visiting professor at Bond University, and has contributed his expertise to various advisory boards at tertiary institutions. Prepare to be captivated, inspired, and informed as we embark on this riveting exploration of forensic psychology with the unparalleled Tim Watson-Munro. Everyone, give us a warm welcome for Tim.
Well, with an introduction like that, I hope you're not disappointed. Thank you for coming. 45 years is a lot to cover in 25 minutes. I worked out it's about 30 seconds per year, but I'll do my best, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So I remember the 14th of August 1978 very well. It was my first day on the tools at Parramatta Jail. I was 25 years of age and I was green as they came. I'd come from a fairly gentrified background. My father was a professor of physics at Sydney University. My mother was a musician and an artist. And I'd had a fairly privileged upbringing. So when I was offered this job, which I didn't think I'd get, my friends who knew me well said, look, don't do it. It'll change you irrevocably. You're a sensitive, creative guy. But the challenge was too much. I took the job and I arrived at Parramatta Jail on this day. And the thing that I remember immediately was the smell of Lysol, which is turbocharged Dettol. It's a disinfectant. It sort of permeated the air everywhere. And the wolf whistles. I was 25 and I looked about 18. So I received all these whistles. I was taken over to the governor of the jail's office, a bloke by the name of Harry Duff. And I remember his office. He had a portrait of the Queen, slightly askew, overused old leather chairs, and he was clearly a bloke who didn't mind a schooner or two. And he said to me, welcome aboard, son. The last psycho, as we were known, lasted 3 months. And we wish you well. My voice wasn't as deep then. I said, thank you very much, Mr. Duff. And he said, I just want to give you another bit of advice, and I'll keep the French down. But he said, remember this, if you can be conned, you can be screwed. And with that, I left his office and then negotiated a maze of gates to get to my office in the administration block. Now, I was very keen, so I'd arrived earlier than I should have, and there was a prison officer on the door. I was so keen to fit in, I didn't wear a suit. I wore a T-shirt and Levi jeans. The T-shirt was green. So I knocked on the door and I said, prison psycho. And he said, "He's not here yet, you dog. Why don't you crawl back under the rock you came from?" And I said, "No, no, no. I'm the prison psycho." And you see, I realised that my green T-shirt was exactly the same T-shirt that the prisoners wore. So that was my introduction to the jail. He apologised profusely. I said, "Look, it's all good. I understand. Let's move on." So in the prison, back then, 46 years ago now, psychologists were a rarity. And there was a big cultural divide. There were prison officers known as screws, and there were prisoners known as crims. And then somewhere in no man's land were people like me who were just damn do-gooders and shouldn't be in the jail. So I had my work cut out for me. I had to establish rapport with the prison officers, because I realised very quickly, without their input and support, I'd be like the last guy who ran out pulling his hair 3 months after he started the job. So it was very hard to get prisoners to trust you. But with me, I was lucky. I had one who came to see me, and back in that day, I used to smoke. Very occasionally, I had Benson Hedges extra mild in my top pocket, and he could see the top gold of the packet. And I could see he was coveting a cigarette, because in jails all they had was White Ox, which was, you know, straight from the barn, basically. And I said, "Would you like a cigarette?" He said, "Oh, I'd love a cigarette." I gave him one, and then he was looking at the Moccona coffee, and I said, "Would you like some proper coffee?" Because they had Gibson's issue coffee, all low budget stuff. So we had a bit of a chat, shook hands. The next day, 5 blokes turned up, because the word had got out that if you go and see the psycho, you'll get a free cigarette and a cup of coffee. So at the end of the week, I had 20 regular clients. You know, they were all turning up, and I think the prison officers looked with some amusement and thought, well, you know, maybe. The next thing I did was I became involved in a number of prison programs. And it was very easy, ironically, paradoxically, to do it in Parramatta Jail, because it was a multi-recidivist maximum security jail, which meant that people were not going anywhere. It was an end-of-the-line jail for these people. And because of that, you could set up programs confident in the knowledge that they wouldn't be moved somewhere else in the middle of the night, because there was nowhere else to take them. So I became involved in a program known as the Parramatta Recidivist Group, and it involved a group of 4 prisoners who were trained in counselling, and we set up what was ultimately proved to be a very successful crime deterrent scheme, where juvenile offenders were sent to jail for 1 day as an experiential learning process for them. The idea came from the Rahway State Prison in New Jersey. There was a program that they had called Scared Straight. Our program was better. Fear is a very short-term motivator. Experience, if you experience jail, we figured that people would be more likely to retain the lessons learned. So these guys came in, they were referred by the courts. It was the last option for them, and they would spend the morning as a prisoner, dressed in a prison uniform, meaningless prison tasks, polishing locks, doing that sort of stuff. And they would then be locked up in the afternoon for their lunch. And then following that, they would have the counselling session with the 4 prisoners, who would say, well, look, you know, you're in today because you've been stealing cars. I'm now doing life for murder, but 20 years ago, I came to jail for stealing cars. And it proved to be very successful. Arising from that, we were invited to go on the Mike Walsh show. Never heard before, getting maximum security jail prisoners onto TV, but we had a reformist Corrective Services Commission, and so off we went to Channel 9. these guys, their outfits were sort of 20 years beforehand, so it was quite comical to see us all there. As it eventuated, Mike Walsh was sick, and we had Jimmy Hannon. Does anyone remember Jimmy Hannon? He was the guy with the radioactive teeth, and nobody had briefed him on who we were, it was all about, because Mike had called in sick. So we prepared a little video, and he watched the video. It went out to the audience around Australia, and then it was me and two prisoners. One was doing life for murder. The other, Kevin Brown, was doing 25 years for a series of armed robberies. So he said, well, Ray, the murderer, why are you in jail? And he said, well, I'm ashamed, but I killed my wife, and so on. And then there was another guy, Arthur, and he was there for robbing banks. And then Jimmy looked at me and he said, and Tim, why are you in jail? And I said, well, I'm the prison psychologist, Jimmy, and they cut to an ad break. But out of that program, we got a lot of publicity, a lot of public support. The other couple of programs I set up was the first drug rehab program in any jail in New South Wales, and that worked pretty successfully. And the other one was the concert committee. It was the International Year of the Child, and there was a guy by the name of George Crawford. He was placed in charge of this program, and we persuaded all the major rock and roll acts of the day to come into the jail on consecutive Sundays to perform for the prisoners, and to record the sessions, and then to create an album, an LP album, as they were back then, which was called Canned Rock. And all the proceeds from the royalties which they donated went to the International Year of the Child. So what did I learn out of all this? That people, no matter what their circumstances, whatever they may have done, and a lot of the people there have done very bad things, there's always potential there. There's always some talent, and if you can dig into that talent, it's very worthwhile. Arising from the Day in Jail program, I was invited to give a paper in Melbourne on the program, and it was through that process that I met the now late Dr. David Syme. He was an eminent forensic psychiatrist in Melbourne, and he said, you should come and work with me. And I said, look, I'm really flattered, but you have to understand I live in Balmain, and that was an important thing for me. I lived between two hotels and I had a good quality of life. But he started referring me work, and, you know, greed is good, would say. I came down for a weekend and I said, look, I've enjoyed this. I'll come down for a year. We'll see how we go. Well, that was October 1981. So that started my career in private practice. In order to establish myself here, I took on an academic position at Phillip Institute, now RMIT, and through RMIT I met a number of senior police who were doing the degree there, and I then became involved in assisting the police with profiling and dealing with stress and lecturing at detective training school. So all the time building up the practice, building up the profile and so on. I think the big break came was 1987, so about 6 years later. I was retained to assess Julian Knight. Julian Knight had committed the Hoddle Street atrocity, and they wanted to have a psychological workup on him as well as a psychiatric one. And I spent about a year with Knight. There was no mental state defence, but that raised my profile even further, and the work kept coming in. And it just went from there. Other big cases followed. Alan Bond was referred to me. I spent a bit of time in Perth assessing his brain and his memory. It was quite controversial at the time, and a few other big cases as well, including a number of the now deceased notorious gangland figures, people like Alphonse Gangitano, the Moran brothers. There was a whole gaggle of them, and I looked back and I realised that with the underworld war, in excess of 20 of my clients had been murdered during that time. So they were pretty rough and ready days. During that time I married and had at that stage 2 children. And, you know, I think, you know, the next lesson, if I can give a lesson, is the importance of not burning out, because I had raging burnout and depression. I was working 100 hours a week. You know, I was just juggling my life in a crazy way. And so I fell into a very deep depressive illness. And attendant to that, you know, I developed a problem with cocaine. It was well publicised at the time. And I got into a fair bit of strife with the registration board. I lost my ticket for a number of years. And it was during that time that I thought, you've really got to take stock of your life. And if you get back into practice, you've got to make sure you don't repeat those errors of overwork and hubris and ego and all the rest of it. So when all that happened, I was offered a position at Bond University as an adjunct visiting professor, which I was very grateful to take. I went into recovery. I had treatment for the depression, and I got back into business in about, well, just on 20 years ago now, 2004. I started getting work from Sydney, where I came from originally. And again, you know, the big cases came in. So I had a number of the first terrorists referred to me. One guy in particular, Lodi, was the first person charged under the retrospective anti-terrorism laws in Australia, brought in by John Howard. And he was an interesting character. He was an architect. He lived in the suburbs. He had a highly qualified wife. And he was caught, you may recall back then, there were a lot of ads about if you notice anything suspicious, if you leave a bag, you see a bag unattended, call this number. Well, thank goodness for everyone, someone noticed some strange things going on, and they contacted the police, and he was charged with very serious acts of terrorism. He actually hadn't committed them, but he had the intention to, you know, blow up people, basically. I had a number of the major bikies referred to me. There was a murder at Sydney Airport, this internecine dispute between the Comancheros and the Hells Angels. Mick Howie, who was the national president of the Comancheros, was referred to me. He was charged with murder. It was reduced on appeal, and eventually it was just, you know, assault occasioning grievous bodily harm because he didn't swim the bollard. But I realised that, you know, I was starting to get immersed again, working too much, and I started to pull back from those sorts of clients. In the interim period, as was mentioned by Stephen, I was appointed the national chairman of the College of Forensic Psychologists. I did that for a number of years. I was involved in establishing the first doctorate in forensic psychology at Melbourne University. I was on an advisory board, and then I lectured those students in the assessment of offenders. And then, as I mentioned, after my nadir, I was offered a position at Bond University, and I sat on advisory boards there and at Melbourne University. So I've always tried to mix it up a bit with academic involvement and practical work. Most recently, I've been tapping into that creativity. Probably, I don't know where it came from, but so I've written a couple of books. They were both bestsellers. One was Dancing with Demons. The other was titled A Shrink in the Clink. And it looked at all sorts of different cases and so on. I've done a number of documentaries. I've formed an alliance with Dr. Xanth Mallet, who you probably see regularly on morning TV. She's an associate professor of criminology at the University of Newcastle. And we worked on a 4-hour documentary on Ivan Milat called Buried Secrets. I've done a number of others looking inside the mind of killers, and I do quite a bit of media stuff. I've got another book in train looking at, and I think it's obviously very topical at the moment, why men hurt women. I mean, it's a national disgrace that we have. Last year, I think 56 women were killed by males that they know, either partners or estranged partners and so on. So I'm working on that. And Xanth and I have also done a podcast series together. It's called Motive and Method. We completed series 2 at the end of last year. I'm very proud to say we got to number 5 on Spotify. And so I now have much more balance in my life than I had back then. I'm getting older, clearly, more family time. Now 5 adult children, grandchild, another one on the way. And in the wake of COVID, I relocated to Byron Bay. And so I was spared the traumas associated with lockdown in Melbourne. I had a daughter living in New York, and I got her out of there. I said, we can fight about it next week, but you're on a plane tomorrow. And she came and she lived with me up there for a couple of years. So what have I learned through all of this? I mean, yes, thousands, 30,000 plus clients in court all the time. I've learned that for me, I always look for the good in people. I try and encourage people to do better. I try not to be judgmental. Having been through the mill myself, I know what that's all about. And it's so important picking up on the professor's talk about looking after yourself. The psychosocial health, I think, is going to be the next big thing globally, that we can do a lot in the preventive sphere if we take care earlier on in our lives and so on. So I just want to double check all my notes, and I think I'm pretty much on time. Yes. So I guess in closing, I've had a great life. It's had the ups and downs. I've had the privilege of experiencing things that people only read about or avoid, but I've met a very interesting spectrum of human beings along the way. People say I should now sort of look at semi-retirement, but we were talking about it at lunch. I have this firm view, for me, that to stay physically active, you have to keep your brain mentally active. You have to have things to do. You have to have purpose in life. And of course, you have to be mindful of your age too and not overdo it. So regular walks, music, kids and work is the right balance for me. So I think we're right on time. Thank you for listening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to ask a few questions from the audience.
Yes, now it's question time. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. If you look at the research, you look at those cases, often these memories have been retrieved through hypnosis. The people who are hypnotised are highly suggestible. And the cases you referred to, which I think are the ones I've looked at, rightly so, should have been thrown out. It's been tried in Australia, but, it's vigorously challenged in court, as it should be. Now, I'm not saying that people don't have traumatic memories and they're repressed, but the process of extracting that, it's so vulnerable to manipulation and suggestion, I don't think it should be taken terribly seriously. Yes. The person with the... Oh, okay, we'll start with you. Hi. In terms of the carers or the offenders? Oh, it's a very good question. I mean, I've been on a soapbox for decades about this in terms of prevention is better than cure, early education is better than locking up, and it starts at home. But the problem is quite a number of these people that you see in juvenile facilities come from very dysfunctional homes. It's also about education. I mean, I think beyond the the 3 R's that kids learn in primary school. There should be classes on social skills training, conflict resolution, problem solving, those sorts of things. So I think that we need to start much earlier than we do. Much of the stuff that goes on in juvenile detention is reactive, not proactive. Now, that's not to say there's not programs there, they are there, but it's very difficult to get to square one with these people once they're institutionalised like that. The only thing I'd add to that, which I think is relevant, is just this escalating substance use issue we have globally and in Australia. I can remember when I started working, you rarely saw 18-year-olds in a jail like Parramatta. Now you go to maximum security jails, you're seeing 18-year-olds charged with murder, and it's often, more often than not, a function of unbridled drug addiction, drugs like ice, evil stuff, which impacts on judgment, highly addictive, and they have no judgment. So the curve has straightened. It's almost like exponential, you know, very straight. Yes. That person with the beard, just there, please. Oh, look, again, with respect, a great question. There's all sorts of red flags, right, in relationships. Coercive control, toxic masculinity, they're names we throw around and labels we throw around, but it's really recognising the problem before you're part of the problem. I mean, most of these women that are killed are in or are attempting to leave abusive relationships. And the most dangerous time for a woman is when she actually tries to get out of that situation. These guys have glass jaws, they're entitled and big egos. One of the podcast episodes Xanth and I did was on Hannah Clark. For those who don't know the name, she was a woman who was set alight with her 3 children by her partner in Queensland. And all the red flags are there. We interviewed a number of other people. They all speak to the same thing. Coercive control, trying to keep people away from family, friends, isolating them. Why do you want to go out? You stay at home, controlling their money and so on. So it's multifactorial and very complex, but I don't think it's impossible to deal with, or at least reduce the number of killings we have. Our program was highly successful. It was researched by the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and on a 2-year follow-up, 60% of the referrals, as we describe them, were not seen in a court again. And I think the difference is this, that, as I mentioned, ours was based on experiential learning. So when they were locked up over lunchtime, and they polished the locks, there was never any direct threat against them. When they were counselled by the 4 prisoners, it wasn't saying, look, if you come in here, you're going to be bashed and all the rest of it. It was just about, this is what life will be like for you in jail. You know, you'll lose contact with your family. Obviously, there's sexual abuse that goes on and so on. But it wasn't the ham-fisted approach that they adopted at Railway State Prison. I think you can still get the documentary based on the Railway one. It's called Scared Straight, and you'll see what I mean if you watch it, about trying to scare people. Fear is a short-term motivator, as you would probably know from your esteemed career on the bench, you know. But if people get the insight, if the switch goes, aha, I don't want to go down that path, it can be far more effective long-term. There we go.
With the juveniles across Australia, Tim, what is the solution, or what do you advise as to how do we stop that?
Well, I'd firstly say not all juveniles break the law, but for those that do, and it's clearly seems to be an escalating problem in terms of the lowering age of serious crime. So we have allegedly 4 people in Brisbane, one of them allegedly stabbed a 70-year-old grandmother over the weekend. We had an esteemed medical practitioner in Melbourne who was murdered the week before, home invasion, car theft gone wrong. I have friends that have been subject to having their cars stolen at knife point in Melbourne. So there's no argument it's a growing problem. I think it gets back to better education. It was something I spoke about this morning on a podcast, accountability and responsibility of parenting. And, you know, often the argument is, well, you know, we can't do anything about our kids, or there's no consequences for these kids. And I suspect if you drill down in terms of their developmental history, there's never been boundaries or consequences established for them. So there's no simple solution to it. And, you know, I would say that some people who commit, even juveniles who commit violent crimes, if they commit a further offence on bail, it should just be bail refused, no argument, because there's been a number of these cases where offenders have allegedly been on bail and then committed even more serious crimes. It's a complex issue. It's a good question.
I think we're all done. Yes, round of applause for Tim. Now, you will not be going empty-handed, Tim. We've got our 200% socks for you to keep you warm in the days of Byron Bay, but also your travels across still working. So again, on behalf of Rotary Melbourne, thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you. We'll compare colours. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Before we close, look, thanks to all visitors and guests for attending today. We'd also like to thank MC Rosemary Nixon and the Reflections of Peter Dakin for today, of our lunch setup and reception teams for their continued efforts. Just a special notice reminder, next week we will be having our evening picnic at the on Wednesday evening at Rotary Peace Park, an amazing night, so please come on down. I've got a special box as well that I'd like to share with the club as well for that evening. Also next week, on the Friday night, we've got the annual architectural walk guided by our very own club architect, Barbara. Where's Barbara? Have a chat with her after this. Again, a credible walk around Fitzroy by Barbara. Some spaces are still available, so please check the detail in the bulletin and please join us for these special events. Please stand to close the meeting with our national anthem, led by our closer, and I would say our own Pavarotti of Melbourne, DGE Michael Lapina. Thank you.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. With golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every state advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Thank you.